me. I'm a resident of Kenilworth. I've lived in Kenilworth for more than 40 years. And although I've retired, I chair an organisation called the UK's Building Performance Network. So I'm very much into how buildings perform, whether they are new buildings, old buildings, retrofitting, whatever. And the Building Performance Network is very much linked to sister companies of or sister not-for-profit companies, organisations such as the Passive House Trust and the Green Homes, Good Homes Alliance. Our speaker this evening is Andrew Brown. Andrew is a software engineer by training, and through his work with computer science, it led him to investigating something called PAS 2030. And a PAS is nearly a British standard. It's a publicly available specification. Let's see what's happened to my screen. So PAS 30 was launched in 2012, and then that's been superseded in 2019 by PAS 2035, and Andrew will explain a bit more about that. Andrew established a company called TradeEngine, and this came about as a result of a project where he was developing electronic quality management systems. In 2016, TradeEngine secured a project management contract with British Gas under the Energy Company Obligation, which is the ECO for short, which they still work on today. They manage a framework contract whereby installers of energy efficiency measures of different types can work together to deliver lifetime energy bill savings under this particular obligation. Since the latest version of PAS 25 was released, TradeEngine has become a retrofit coordinator organisation. Again, you'll learn more about that tonight. This sees them implementing a whole house approach to domestic retrofit that is compliant with this standard called PAS 2035. So without more ado, I'd like to hand over to Andrew. He'll do a little introduction of himself so you can see what he looks like, and then he's got a number of slides just to go through. Then I'll host a question and answer session. So Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, George. Can you hear me okay? Can you okay, George?
Yes, I can hear you okay, Andrew.
Brilliant.
Yep.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. That pretty much sums up our background as a company. Yeah, back in 2012, you may remember that a scheme called the Green Deal was launched by the government. Sadly, it was a failed attempt at this type of work. But what it brought along is a method of standardisation for the industry as a whole. By the industry, we're talking, businesses who install in domestic properties with a view to upgrading their energy efficiency. Prior to 2012, there was very little standardisation around the industry, and it's gradually moved on, and compliance has become tougher, which we think is a good thing, because ultimately, as professionals in the industry, we're working on people's homes, their lifetime investments, but we have to live in them every day, and we can't have an industry that's doing things to properties, which isn't of benefit to both the property and its occupants. So the standard PAS 2030, which this is the latest version, it's quite a big book. It tells me or anybody who picks it up exactly what they might need to do to follow a process and a customer journey, and to implement that customer journey through design, specification, installation of energy efficiency measures on existing buildings. So you'll hear me use the term retrofit quite a lot, because that's a nice way of summing up exactly what we do. We're taking a building that already exists, is the properties of which, in terms of energy efficiency, are probably quite poor to begin with, and we're converting that into a building which, as far as we reasonably can, meets modern building regulations in relation to energy efficiency. So that's the process that we sort of oversee. Now, I've got a set of slides, and then what we're hoping to do, I'll run through my presentation, which will take about 20 minutes. I can waffle on about certain topics, so George, you will kindly move me on and say next slide, please, which is something we hear quite often these days. And then, we're hoping to open this up into more of a question and answer session, because as residents of Kenilworth, you no doubt, and by virtue of the fact that you're in this web conference, you're no doubt interested in the Green Homes Grant, how it can benefit you and what you can achieve by accessing it. So we'd like to open up as much time as possible to answering questions. If I don't know the answers, I'm afraid I'll have to hold my hands up and say I don't know, but hopefully we'll be okay. So shall I share my slide deck with you then?
Yes, please do,
yeah.
Andrew.
And George, have we got the correct, you can see that full screen?
Yes, I can see that full screen. Yep. Okay.
Well, I should also say thank you to Kenilworth Town Council for inviting me to present today. It's George mentioned that he chairs the Building Performance Network. We're a member as a business of the Building Performance Network, a recent member, no doubt, but it's nice to get involved and have this sort of opportunity to tell the general public more about what we do. So as a brief agenda, we're focusing entirely today on the Green Homes Grant, which is a new government scheme. It was announced in August, sort of formally launched, and we began to assist customers in September. The administration of the scheme has taken a little while to get off the ground, but it is getting there now. And initially, it was due to run until March 2021, so March this year, but that was never going to be feasible with COVID and so on. So currently, it's been extended by a year at least. There are further extensions of further schemes in the pipeline, which we will mention a little bit about. I'll go through, the purpose of the scheme, what it involves, the types of energy efficiency measures that homeowners and landlords and tenants can access, and eligibility for those, who can do the work, and we'll give some information about how one can actually apply for a grant, what that process entails, and should you be interested, how to take that forward. So I think George has given a very good summary of what we do as a business already. We've moved from the initial standardisation of the industry happening 8 or 9 years ago. One of the ways to achieve that was through software, because installation companies do jobs in volume, and the one thing I often say about anything to do with standardisation is, if, for example, I'm making cardboard boxes as a business, I want to make sure that every cardboard box I make is the same and has the same properties, so that the contents fit. And the same approach applies here, but the difference being that every single dwelling in the UK is different. Even houses which we think are neighbouring and identical all display different properties. And so the standardisation process has moved more towards a kind of holistic approach, whereby it's not just about the case of, oh, I can see that this property has no loft insulation and therefore that's what gets installed, but rather what are the correct measures for this particular dwelling based on all this sort of set of data. So a lot of what we do as a business is about using software to pull that data in and then to do some reasoning about it, for the benefit of the dwelling and its occupants. George has already mentioned and given a good overview, I think, of what we do. A lot of our activities relate to actually training installer businesses as to how to implement these types of standards, but we are an installer business in our own right, as well as a retrofit coordinator. So we oversee the process of retrofit from start to finish, and then either do the work ourselves or instruct partners that we know to do the work based on our specifications. We're based in Tamworth. Well, we have two kind of operational hubs. Our head office is in Tamworth. It's currently empty, bar me. And we cover the area, if you can see that's shown there on the screen, broadly speaking. And then our actual operations teams are based in Northampton, or near Northampton. That map, it looks a little bit strange, and there's all sorts of reasons why that map is the shape it is, to do with travelling times, where employees live, and all sorts of things. But Kenilworth is, located within that area, and is an area that we use to covering. Currently doing quite a lot of Green Homes Grant projects and overseeing them in Coventry, Nuneaton, Bedworth, Tamworth, and Northampton. So a band that kind of runs up along the M1/M6 corridor. This is one a photograph that I always like to include. It's actually an artist's impression. It's a project we managed last year in Stoke-on-Trent. This was a very grey, dull, very highly inefficient, basically as bad as it can get on an EPC building of flats and masonettes on a main road in Stoke-on-Trent. It was purchased by a young chap who is a property investor, and he really wanted to do something to upgrade this building, and so through a whole series of improvements, which were part funded through the energy company obligation over the course of about a year, these dwellings went from really being highly inefficient, very expensive to run, electrically heated properties, through to being in Band C on an EPC and meeting all sorts of targets in terms of climate change obligations. So that's a summary of what we do. Let's speak more now about the reason we're here, the Green Homes Grant, and why are the government doing this? They appear to be funding all sorts of things at the moment for various reasons, but there seems to be some quite generous subsidies towards energy efficiency measures. But there's a whole sort of set of reasons behind this, which, when linked together, actually create a very interesting picture. First off, we have a climate emergency globally. You don't need to listen to the news for too long to understand that global temperatures are rising by degrees. This could cause all sorts of knock-on effects to ecosystems and the planet in general, and we obviously have to live here. So government's participation in national and international climate change objectives, one of the ways that the government can achieve this is by assessing and upgrading the housing stock, because the UK housing stock is quite dense, and is one of our biggest emitters in terms of carbon emissions. And one of the sub-aims, the aim is to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050, but a sub-aim of that is that every single dwelling in the UK will reach what's called Band C on an EPC, EPC being an energy performance certificate, by the year 2035. EPCs are banded from A to G, A being the best performing buildings, G being the worst performing buildings, sorry, E, F, G, yes, it is G. And the majority of properties in the UK hover around bands D and E at the moment. So every home, not every single home, but the majority has to have something done to it to bring it into that band C. And we think that going forward, and it's early days to say, but this could have some knock-on effect in terms of things that we used to about our properties. So it may be that mortgage interest rates are pinned more towards energy efficiency, or it may be council tax is reduced for more efficient properties and so on. We don't know, and that's all things that are yet to be legislated. But it does no harm to start to address upgrading the efficiency of our buildings. The Green Homes Grant Scheme also does something which, in times of COVID and so on, is hopefully going to make a big change, and that is we're creating jobs in a new sector. Well, it's a sector that's been around for a good 10 or 15 years, but we're improving this sector, and there's a lot of jobs that can be created as a result of this scheme. a lot of training that can be delivered and upskilling that can happen. And I'll mention that a little bit later on. Fuel poverty is also a big issue in the UK. We believe the best definition of fuel poverty is that a household spends more than 20% of its monthly income on fuel. And in my day-to-day job, I've seen some horrendous figures. I had a customer up in much further north than the area that we actually cover, but I was speaking to them on the phone the other day, and it transpired they were spending, in the month of December, and they had spent nearly £1,000 on electricity alone. So there we've got a real engineering challenge to try and help that customer, and you can confidently say that that bill can be reduced by as much as 2/3. The Green Homes Grant, as I mentioned, launched back in September. So this is one opportunity that homeowners and tenants have to upgrade their properties. Another opportunity, there's a funding scheme that has run for many years called the Energy Company Obligation. The difference between the two, the government directly provide the funding for Green Homes Grant. So the funding is payable to the installer of the measures once they're complete, and that's coming directly from the government. Whereas the Energy Company Obligation is a levy placed on energy companies where, depending on the number of customers they all have an obligation to assist those in fuel poverty. Both schemes run side by side. There can be some crossover, which is something I'll mention later. Current iterations of these schemes, Green Homes Grant will run through till March 2022, and the current iteration of the Energy Company Obligation till September. But there are schemes coming along after that. We believe the Green Homes Grant will be replaced by something called the Home Upgrade Grants. Energy Company Obligation is currently in its third iteration, and it's already due to go out to consultation very shortly, what the fourth iteration of that will look like, running through till 2026. So one hopes that there will be a steady stream of accessible and available funding for a good number of years yet. So looking more at, anybody participating in this web conference, probably looking at this as to, I'm maybe interested in accessing the Green Homes Grant funding, may want to know, what are the benefits to them. Well, we see that the current contributions towards energy efficiency through the Green Homes Grant in the main are actually quite generous. There is some speculation as to whether they're high enough. We'll come on to that later, but they are quite generous contributions, the likes of which we haven't really seen in the past. So it's a good opportunity to look at that because it can significantly reduce the cost of doing this type of work. The fact that those contributions are generous means more can be done to the whole envelope of the building. What would traditionally happen with energy efficiency and funded schemes is people would have their lofts insulated, possibly cavity wall insulation, but very unlikely if they live in a solid wall property to have had solid wall insulation, because the cost of that was, far higher than any grant scheme would award. So that's changed very slightly, and the walls of buildings are the biggest surface area, and therefore 35% of heat generally escapes through the walls. Most people, not everybody, but a good proportion of the property housing stock in the country has had some form of roof insulation done already. Another thing, another few benefits of doing and accessing the Green Homes Grant were a reduction in carbon emissions for your individual dwelling. So much in the same way that we're all buying vehicles that are more efficient, we can also have homes that are more efficient, and I suppose it's in some way a socially responsible thing to do, or is becoming so. But also, obviously, there's going to be a reduction in energy bills. So with the Green Homes Grant contribution blended with a customer contribution, the customer contribution can be relatively small, and so it's very easy to see that can be made back simply by the savings made in utility bills. Okay, so the scheme itself was launched as a £2 billion scheme. There's a lot of press attention to that figure at the moment, and I think we're best coming on to that in the Q&A if anybody has any questions. But funding is available, and we as an organisation are fairly confident with what's been allocated and what could be changed around. Green Homes Grant funds two main streams of what we term a measure. You'll hear me use the term measure a lot. A measure is simply anything that I install on a building. So it might be wall insulation, that is one measure, or it might be something to do with a heating system, that is another measure. So any energy efficiency home improvement we would determine to be a measure. And these are split into categories, which we'll come on to later. So the grant scheme itself primarily focused at insulation and heating measures, but only those which are low carbon heating measures. So that's generally renewable technology. The scheme itself is split into both primary and secondary measures. It gets a little bit complicated because there are rules, again, which we'll come on to, about the order in which things have to be quoted and what one can do. The vouchers themselves, so the scheme issues a voucher to the customer. The customer can have any number of vouchers up to a limit of £5,000 to fund up to 2/3 of the cost of the work. So I've got some worked examples a bit later on in the slides which will cover that. But basically, to sum it up in a nutshell, the government's paying 2/3 of the cost of the work. The homeowner's paying 1/3 up to that final £5,000 limit. Anything above that obviously would need to be contributed by the homeowner, and that's accessible to anybody regardless of income, regardless of property type. Every home has that fund that it can access. There are then a set of vouchers worth £10,000 for those who are on low incomes or on some form of benefit. And this can all be assessed via the government website, which I'll include a link to later to see what the eligibility is there. With the £10,000 voucher contributions, the customer does not need to make a contribution unless the cost of what they're proposing exceeds that £10,000 limit. What we'll also say with the £10,000 contribution, worth mentioning, is that would automatically deem the customer also eligible for energy company obligation funding. Now, unfortunately, that can't be used to subsidise the same measures or the same technologies on the property, but there might be a plan to install a number of different technologies and measures. And so a retrofit coordinator organisation like ourselves could help the customer to navigate that and work out what was the best way to access those two sources of funding and to combine them for the building. The work under the Green Homes Grant needs to be completed by a specifically registered and certified business or set of businesses. These businesses need to be registered on Trustmark, and they need to have the relevant PAS 2030 or MCS certifications, which we'll come on to later. So they actually have to be a certified organisation and Trustmark registered in order to participate in the scheme. Unfortunately, this means quotes from local builders and so on will not be viable under the scheme unless those builders should wish to participate in the process of becoming accredited. When a voucher is issued, initially it has provides a 3-month window for the work to happen, but that can actually be extended, and we're finding that that's quite a straightforward process now. And consumers are generally recommended under the Green Homes Grant to seek quotes from 3 Trustmark registered businesses to give a good frame of reference. That said, that can actually be quite difficult to achieve just because of the volume of registered companies, and it depends on the technologies and the measures that you're interested in. Okay, so the scheme eligibility in terms of what can I actually install on my property? Well, for a start, it's worth pointing out I can only install something that I may actually need. So if I've had something done already, then I can't claim funding for it. So the property there needs to be a demonstrable need for that measure at that point in time at an initial survey. Measures are then split into two categories, primary and secondary. Primary measures are focused towards insulation and low carbon heating measures. So they're things like wall insulation, floor insulation, roof insulation, and so on. And on the heating side, renewable technologies. So things like ground and air source heat pumps, solar thermal, or a biomass boiler. That's what would be deemed the primary measures. They're also more expensive measures generally to deliver. But one can, let's say, if I spend £3,000 on a primary measure of my available grant funding, I can spend anything up to the limit of the grant or the overall cost of the primary measure, whichever is the lower of the two amounts, on a secondary measure as well, or more than one secondary measure perhaps. It gets a bit confusing, but we'll do some worked examples a bit later on. And the secondary measures cover things like draft proofing, windows and doors. On the building fabrics side, it's worth pointing out it's only eligible, the measure is only eligible for double or triple glazing if the property currently has single glazing. But we are told by the scheme administrator it could just be a number of single glazed windows in the property could be replaced if the rest are already double glazing. And similarly, on the heating side, secondary measures cover generally heating controls and insulating the heating system. So that's installing things like smart thermostats and so on. George, am I okay for time so far?
Yes, yeah, we're doing okay.
Okay. Right, so coming on to the standards, I'll briefly skim over this. So we've covered a bit about the Green Homes Grant and the voucher system and the types of technologies that I could use this funding to install. We mentioned earlier that George mentioned at the beginning a standard called PAS 2035, which is an overall standard that oversees the whole processes and a framework for delivery of retrofit projects, and going forward will be widely adopted for any such schemes. At the moment, PAS 2035 is an optional thing for Green Homes Grant work, but is going to become mandatory, and compliance with it is going to be mandatory from the 1st of July this year. The reason I'm mentioning this, so we'd like consumers generally to get into the mindset that what we're going to try and achieve, and the right thing to try and do, is to look at the whole house and to try and deliver a whole house approach to retrofit with what we also call a fabric first approach. And the understanding here is that there's no point in installing a new heating system in a building if that building is not properly insulated, for example. So we look at the insulation, the building properties of that, and the insulation that can be achieved. We make the building effectively more airtight to perform better, and then from a heating perspective, the heating demand both for space heating and hot water heating reduces. Then would be the time to consider how that building is heated. The retrofit coordinator, of which we're one of about 50 such firms who are Trustmark registered nationally to do this, is responsible for creating something called the medium-term low carbon plan. So by speaking with a retrofit coordinator, you'll be able to they'll be able to work with you to identify a plan for your specific dwelling, which maps out and gives you a bit of a roadmap as to the types of work that need to happen to the property to achieve both bringing it into Band C on the EPC, but also to achieve, the overall aims in terms of retrofit, but doing that in what we call a carbon cost-effective manner. So some measures may save, some measures may cost a lot to deliver, but may not save very much over their lifespan. And they're the measures that we've got to kind of pay attention to and consider, are they really worth it? And the retrofit coordinator works with the consumer to try and build this medium-term low carbon plan to give a picture of not just what needs to happen to the property immediately today or this year or within the scope of this scheme, but generally over the next 5, 10 and 15 years, the type of work that could be specified or prescribed. I'll briefly, I've mentioned most of this. So the coordinator then, and gradually this is becoming the central role in retrofit, is responsible for overseeing the work. They may instruct an assessor to actually visit and do an energy retrofit assessment of the property. Retrofit assessment comprises an energy performance report, an occupancy assessment and a condition report. The coordinator then takes that information back, does some analysis on the data that it's provided, and then comes up with this medium-term plan for a package of measures over a period of time. And we'll be able to liaise with you to help fit those measures in with the funding that's available. And then finally, those projects get passed to the installer for each individual technology, who will be an expert in that particular type of retrofit to do the work. The installer then, the coordinator then receives all that information back, processes it in such a way that it gets lodged with Trustmarque, and we'll come on to Trustmarque's role in the process shortly. Okay, so I've mentioned briefly a few of the measures that are eligible under the scheme. I'm just going to focus on 4. These are the higher value measures, and it will really depend on the type of property that you have and the type of property that you want to look at as to whether these types of measures fit in to the plan, or whether it's a set of more lightweight measures. I, for example, live in a house that was built in 1993. It's had pretty much everything that that's needed to be done to it. There are a few things that I could do. I think I worked out, there's limited scope to the way I could use the Green Homes Grant, but I could use it. Whereas other properties have, a much more demanding set of measures that need to be installed. So I'll focus on 4 of these, and these are the higher value ones that, is where the grant really comes into its own, because it's contributing towards some quite expensive set of works. Solid wall insulation, so any solid wall property can be insulated either internally or externally. We as a business would try and our consultants and so on would try and probably look at the external solid wall insulation being preferable to internal, simply because it's easier to design in such a way that minimises and eliminates thermal bridging. The number of fixtures and fittings on the inside of a building are generally far greater than those on the outside. External wall insulation involves initially we assess the building fabric, we look at the condition, we see that it's suitable. There's then a whole series of what we term enabling works that needs to happen to reposition external surfaces and so on, so that we can treat the whole building. It's not a good idea with external wall insulation to go around anything. And the reason being for that, there are a few exceptions, but generally speaking, any cold surface that's left once a building is insulated is deemed a thermal bridge, and that can lead to condensation, damp and mold building up on the cold surfaces, a bit like a cold can of Coca-Cola. On a hot day, you'll find that condensation builds up on the surface of that because the warm, moist air gravitates towards the coldest point. So looking at solid wall insulation, it's really important to consider the overall building and can I do this project and pretty much eliminate thermal bridging. The other thing that we have to look at that's an important consideration is ventilation. It may seem a bit alien to say, right, what we're going to do is insulate a building and then we're going to put holes in the wall to provide ventilation. But it's necessary because, and it's got to be designed correctly, because by insulating a building, we make it more airtight, and warm, moist air builds up in wet rooms, in kitchens and bathrooms. That needs to be extracted from the building, but nor do we want stale air to be building up inside the building. We want that to be replaced with fresh air. So the way the PAS 2035 standard is going is not just about creating more efficient buildings, but it's creating healthier homes as well, and nicer environments for people to live in. So hopefully things like internal condensation, black mold, damp, etc. become things of the past. External wall insulation, there's a couple of examples there of jobs we're working on currently. That's the lower image is a bungalow in Loughborough, which we handed over today. In fact, just put that in there to show all the services, etc., being repositioned. On that property, we've installed insulation below the damp-proof course as well. So that's really is a kind of PAS 2035 compliant design. The larger property above, that's partway through a similar retrofit project in Tamworth. That's moved on a little bit since that photo was taken. Planning permission can be required for solid wall insulation, and I think we'll cover that in the Q&A, but generally it's not. Generally it's considered permitted development. And the cost of doing so generally depends on the meterage of the external wall area of the property. We're looking about £7,000 to £15,000. As you can see, a Green Homes grant makes a big contribution towards that. If a property is of cavity wall construction, so those built slightly later from about 1930 onwards, although we find pockets of solid wall insulation properties that are much newer than that in various areas of the Midlands. So cavity wall will have two brick leaves in effect. The brick bond pattern will be slightly different, so it'll be a structure bond, bed lines and so on, whereas a solid wall will probably have what's called a Flemish. So that's one of the ways we identify. I do apologise for the pause. My wife's just put me a cup of coffee. The fact that there are two leaves means that there's a void in cavity wall properties that can be filled with cavity wall insulation. It has a bit of a bad reputation, cavity wall insulation. George was asking me about this earlier today. Our view on it is it's quite a good measure. It's quite adequate in most cases, but so long as the correct products are specified and the correct reasoning about things like condensation, damp and ventilation are made pre-install, not simply there's some funding, there's a cavity wall that's unfilled, so we'll fill it and we'll claim the funding. That's kind of the model of old that's caused those problems that we want to avoid. It's a much cheaper measure to deliver than solid wall insulation is. It only takes generally a day to do most properties. The savings aren't quite as good because the thermal performance of the wall isn't quite as good, but it's not too bad, and it's a worthwhile first line measure. On the renewable side, the more costly measures to deliver are things like solar thermal and heat pumps, again, where a Green Homes grant voucher might make a bigger impact. So these are ideal for properties where we've already treated the building fabrics and so on. We've got good wall insulation, roof insulation, maybe even floor insulation. The building envelope's generally been treated, the property's been draft proofed and so on. What else can we do? Well, that's the time to consider how we heat the property. Solar thermal is one more expensive measure to deliver that can be used to heat hot water. It doesn't cover space heating, but it will still cover the water heating requirement, which is quite significant. Solar PV or photovoltaics are a measure which generates electricity using solar panels instead, but unfortunately for whatever reason they're not covered under the Green Homes grant scheme. They are, however, if one was interested in that, the cost of installing solar panels is reducing quite a rapid rate for PV, and there are small incentives like the feed-in tariff and so on. And then one that's gained an awful lot of interest recently on because of the Green Homes grant is installing an air source heat pump. and this has started to happen. I mean, the picture of the air source heat pump there, that's quite a big one for a big property. They're normally much smaller than that, but they are a cost-effective, very cost-effective heating alternative. But there are a lot of considerations to be made, I believe, before installing an air source heat pump. You want the emitters of the property, so the way the heat is put into the room, to be as large as possible, because air source heat pumps extract heat from the external air, and then amplify that heat effectively. But they don't heat up to the same temperatures that gas boilers do, for example. And so to counteract that, you need as large a surface area to be heating. So this could require complete replacement of radiators and pipework, and is most likely to do so, or could require installing underfloor heating. Again, it can become quite an expensive venture. Wouldn't be able to install, and no retrofit coordinator would sign it off anyway, but wouldn't be able to install a heat pump without first addressing the insulation elements of the building. And one of the downsides is they do require some outside space where they're mounted. They also do use electricity to run, and so there's a bit of a calculation which, you know, a good installer or a good coordinator will be able to run through with you to make sure that that's worthwhile. If you currently have a new boiler, so a condensing combination boiler, or it could be a system boiler, but an A-rated boiler for property, and you've had the boiler replaced within the past 2, 3, 4 years, you probably won't notice that much in terms of savings going down the route of installing an air source heat pump. Okay, so that's just a flavour, and we can come on to more in the questions and answers about the types of technologies that are available to access through the Green Homes Grant. The process of accessing them then, there's a government website where, government website links there, or you can simply Google apply for a Green Homes Grant. And they will ask you to identify 3 installers or retrofit coordinators to give you a quote. You can find those by going onto the trustmark.org.uk website, and that will guide you to finding registered firms who have the right certifications to do this type of work. You're then advised to get hold of 3 quotations for the different technologies that you're interested in. That, as I mentioned earlier, can be a bit challenging. The scheme will allow an application with just 1 quotation, so you don't need to get 3, but it's always a good idea to. And then you use those to apply for the vouchers. Once your voucher is awarded, and that process can take a good few weeks, unfortunately, you are then given a 3-month window in which to install the measures for which the vouchers have been issued. And once the installer has done so, any customer contribution would be made clear on the quote and would be made payable to the installer. And then the final step of the process is that the installer then will reclaim the value of the Green Homes Grant voucher from the government.
Andrew, just before we move on to the worked examples, I thought it might be a good idea if we just have some questions.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So I've got a number of questions here. So can I change my 15, 20-year-old gas boiler using the Green Homes Grant?
Unfortunately, the answer to that question is no. For a variety of reasons, it was deemed that the Green Homes Grant would not cover gas boilers. There's a drive that all gas boilers will, well, no new build property will have a gas boiler in it by 2030. So that's only 8 or 9 years away. And the government's reasoning behind this is that gas boilers, you know, at the end of the day, they are emitting carbon dioxide and they're contributing towards carbon emissions. So it would be far preferable to look at measures which don't, you know, have the same carbon footprint effectively. That's under the Green Homes Grant. If somebody living in the property, and it can be anybody that lives in the property, not necessarily the person that owns it, is in receipt of a qualifying state benefit, then you could look to have that boiler replaced under the energy company obligation instead. So that is a possibility. It's a bit of a complicated calculation that an organisation and installer would run through with you, but that is feasible. And I'm afraid beyond that, the only thing to look at is private finance for the boilers.
Okay.
So, yeah.
One of the things, just to say that we'll put a link to Andrew's presentation on the Town Council website so that you'll be able to access the presentation and read the various slides at your leisure. A question, Andrew, relating to one of the pictures that you showed on the bungalow that had been retrofitted with the white render.
Yeah.
And the question is, it looks like that they're just ordinary pipe services exits on the bungalow. What has changed?
There's a thickness of insulation in between, I suppose. So this external wall insulation system is a 90mm insulation board that's encased in a number of layers of cementitious render. So it's an interesting question, what has changed, because we always say, and I say to my clients when I see them, that the best external wall insulation job, what we aim to achieve, is that you can't tell it's been done. It kind of looks natural. The purpose of this, so yeah, but there is a thickness of insulation there. Maybe it'll be in total with render and so on 100mm. So all of those surfaces need to be pulled out from the wall and generally replace. Does that answer the question?
No, you talked about doing something so there weren't any thermal bridges and repositioning the services.
Yes.
And so I don't understand why that is any different from just having a plastic pipe going through a wall. I mean, I understand that there's insulation there now that wasn't there before, but is there not still a thermal bridge where the pipe is?
I see, right, okay, yes. Yeah, so there is a very small one, but in that example, that would be the only way to do that. Yes, I can see what you're mentioning there. That so where possible, so things like boiler condensate pipes and so on, we would try and run them into internal drainage rather than external. So we reduce the number of penetrations through the system. Yes. The reason I put that particular slide there was to demonstrate there's been some bad practice with solid wall insulation over the years. A temptation for installers just to go around items, and you end up with this kind of patchwork quilt of a property, and that's entirely non-compliant. But I do accept that, those service penetrations, the fewer that you make through the external walls of the building, the fewer thermal bridges you have. The other point to make is there's no, those are sealed. So although they're holes, there's no surfaces within them for warm, moist air to condense, basically. So you wouldn't have necessarily the damp issues that would be caused by a traditional thermal bridge.
Thank you, Louise. Another question, what about ground source heat pumps? So you've mentioned air source heat pumps. What about ground source heat pumps?
Yes, also included under the Green Homes Grant scheme. I couldn't, unfortunately, because we'd be here until midnight, feature every available measure and give a description of them. But if anybody does have any questions about any specifics, we can run through those. But yes, under the low carbon heating section of the Green Homes Grant, both ground and air source heat pumps are eligible, and it will really depend on the characteristics of the property and the amount of land that surrounds it, and a whole sort of set of complicated calculations as to which of those is best. Air source heat pump technology is coming down in price quite rapidly. Ground source technologies are, but a lot of groundworks needs to be done to install a ground source heat pump. So it's an eligible measure, but probably best considered if the property has a large garden, an amount of land. If that can be dug up to install the ground source loop, then it's worth investigating. For properties that don't benefit from, from having that, then air source may be the way forward, although there still is obviously a space requirement of sorts.
Okay. A question on, well, a financial question really. Well, two questions I think here. Who hires and pays for the retrofit assessor and coordinator? As the question, and then the subsidiary one, most people don't really know what they need.
Right. Okay, so the retrofit assessor and coordinator, as I say, the approach which utilises those two individuals is not mandatory under the scheme until July, but is going to be. So it's the end customer who would hire effectively the assessor and the coordinator, but both those sets of fees are eligible under the Green Homes grant. And normally the coordinator themselves would then be able to put forward a packaged quote for the installation work, which had been they previously agreed with the customer the scope of works that was going to be undertaken, the order in which things were going to be done, and the plan had been drawn up effectively, and the coordinator could take charge of that and carry that forward as one package of works, instructing the different trades as necessary. So yeah, it's payable for as effectively by the homeowner, but those costs are recoverable through the grant. It's not that the grant just subsidises the cost of the work and the cost of assessment and coordination are not included.
Yeah, I should just add there that when you look on the website for the Green Homes grant, what Andrew says there is absolutely correct, but it's not obvious when you go to the Green Homes grant website. So you go to the Green Homes grant website, and primarily it asks you to choose an installer. At the moment, that will change, as Andrew has said, that when we get on to mandating past 2035, it will ask for either a retrofit coordinator or a retrofit assessor. But the assessment and the preparation of the medium-term low carbon plan, the costs of that is covered by the Green Homes grant.
Yeah.
I have another question. It's quite a long one, this one. We have part of our home that is a separate building, but it's connected by a corridor. We can't use this separate building as at the moment because there's no roof insulation and no heating. It is very cold. Even though it's not part of our main home, will the Green Homes grant cover an improvement to this in terms of insulation?
Yes, is the answer. My understanding is that that's quite viable.
Sorry, you speak up a bit, Andrew. I didn't catch the answer to that question.
Sorry, the short answer I think to that question is yes. Yes, it will. If it's part of the dwelling, as you say, it's connected. There is scope for an improvement there. We might consider whether that is within the heat loss perimeter of the building, but I'd say it was. So yes, that is completely feasible to do that type of thing. We'd have to just with both Green Homes grant and eco, it's too much detail unfortunately to go into now. We just have to pay attention to whether anything could be deemed to be a renovation. If a property is being renovated, then building regulations would state that it had to meet certain things to do with thermal efficiency anyway. So whether one can claim a Green Homes grant for a property that's being renovated is a bit of a grey area. needs to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. But by the sound of it in that particular scenario, I do think that would be possible.
Okay. This question just says white external insulated cladding question mark. I don't know whether the questioner means is it only white that you can have for external cladding?
I think that's referring to there are different types of insulation material that can be used for external wall insulation. Now, the picture that I showed there, possibly not the best image, but that's white because the property has been rendered. So it's got a number of layers of cementitious render that encase and weatherproof the insulation material, and then it's finished with a silicone-based top coat render. And that can be any color. I mean, most manufacturers have 700 or 800 colors, and the color is actually within the render, it's embedded. So that's why that appears to be white. But that question may also be relating to, there is a certain type of external polystyrene-based insulation called YTPS. And in a lot of cases, it's not, you can still use it if there's a BBA product certification for it, but it's kind of frowned upon. It's thicker than it necessarily needs to be. It isn't as dense as the more modern graphite enhanced insulation board. So no, we wouldn't specify YTPS on a property because we'd go down the grey EPS route, and we're now looking and we're specifying fire retardant A1 rated grey EPS insulation. But that question could be relating to that, and for some utterly bizarre reason to me, because YTPS these days goes against best practice, the copy of PAS 2035 that I've got in front of me has somebody installing YTPS insulation and not wearing adequate PPE to do so either. So why they put that on the cover of the standard, I don't know. It's a product that was used a few years back, but their best practice would dictate different types of insulation we use today.
Thank you. We know that double glazing has a particular lifespan. This question is basically asking, how long does cavity wall insulation last, and how can you assess its condition over time?
Right. So any and something is a good question, that, because I haven't covered one of the key points about all this is that all of this work, anything done under the Green Homes Grant or ECO, all gets lodged into something called the Trustmark Data Warehouse. That provides, we term it like a property passport. There's a central store of information about work that's been done to that property. And one of the critical elements of that is that all work that happens here needs to carry an appropriate insurance-backed warranty. And for wall insulation measures, that's 25 years. So any solid external or internal wall insulation or cavity wall insulation would have to, and the installer would arrange this, carry an insurance policy that warranties it for 25 years. And the measure would not be paid for without that. So that gives an indication of the lifespan. That said, that's an absolute minimum. That's the period that it's warranted for. So if cavity wall insulation were to fail within that 25-year period, that insurance policy would pay for it to be removed and replaced. The actual duration and lifespan of cavity wall insulation Ofgem determine to be 38 years based on a whole set of things that they've done some calculations, they've done some research, etc. as an average. But I would also say, correctly installed, that lifespan could easily be 60 or 70 years. With the correct product specification, the correct materials installed in the correct quantities in the right fashion. So a minimum of 25 years, but done correctly, could last 50, 60, 70 years. How do I assess its condition? Right, first off, I'd look for any kind of warning signs. You wouldn't need to assess its condition unless there were any warning signs. So that would be looking at areas around skirting boards, certainly in any areas where moisture can build up. Is there any damp, condensation, black mold, etc.? Again, looking at near the tops of walls where they join up with ceilings. Again, is there any issue there? Because any signs of damp could indicate that moisture is coming from the outside of the building to the inside. So that's kind of a non-invasive way to check from the inside. From the outside, you're going to want to look at pointing, flashings, making sure that gutters and drainage are all clear, and making sure that there are no kind of patches of moisture on the outside of a building on a dry day. So if you see a bit of brickwork on the outside of a building, but it's a dry, sunny day that looks a bit damp, there could be a problem with the cavity wall insulation, which could be transmitting damp into the property. The next thing one can do is, if a problem is suspected, is to ask an installer or an assessor, or there are available what are called cavity surveillance schemes. I know the BBA run one, to come out, and they will drill a series of holes into the cavity, put a borescope in, and just have a look at is the cavity properly filled, or over the years has the insulation kind of sunk down, and in problem areas, is damp being transmitted from the outside to the inside. Is that
Yep.
okay?
Thank you. You mentioned, so lots of people have combi boilers, and I think, did you mention combi boilers? And anyway, one of the questions is, in fact, from Bob Sherman, that Bob has a solar thermal system which is working with a combi boiler. It's not a standard setup, Bob says, but Bob, do you want to explain?
Well, only that we had a combi boiler, and I decided a long time ago to get a solar thermal panel, and so the two had to work together, and the only way to do it was somehow to bypass the combi system. And having done that once when we replaced the boiler, we had to have something similar. So George Robinson came and fiddled about with it for weeks and weeks and weeks and made it work.
Good.
Okay.
Excellent. But normally, the situation, if I'm correct, Andrew, in terms of if we are moving to heat pumps, and replacing combi boilers, we're probably going to have hot water cylinders or heat stores.
Yeah, so either a traditional hot water cylinder or an unvented cylinder, would be the way to go. And I suppose the reason to mention that there, in Bob's case, he must still have some kind of, as you say, heat store for the hot water.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, we had to have one put in.
Right. Yeah, albeit that the heating engineer's done something clever, and I'm afraid I'm not near myself to kind of link those two up, but generally, some form of storage of the hot water that's created would be required. Yeah.
Okay. Before we move on to your worked examples, the last question I've got here at the moment, anyway, is, and this is a question on employment, which I think is interesting because it's one of the things that you mentioned as a benefit out of COVID and moving towards more energy efficient properties. And the question is, what is being done to increase opportunities for young people to include these new retrofit skills?
Right. Okay, that's an interesting one, and I'm going to skip forward right to the end. I threw in a slide near the end, asking if anybody watching, but it could be not just anybody watching, but somebody who knows somebody who's a tradesperson, or it could simply be a case that you have a tradesperson. Let's say he's a builder or a heating engineer or a plumber or somebody that you use for years and you would really like to do this work, but they're not registered, then there is funding available for those people to become trained and qualified to participate in the Green Homes Grant scheme. It's done through something called, so the government ran, when they launched the Green Homes Grant, they launched something called the Green Homes Grant Skills Training Competition, which put £7 million funding pot towards creation of, or rather upskilling of 5,000 new individuals and 250 more businesses, because it's been recognised that there could well be a shortage of installers here, to participate in the scheme. Trade Engine bid for a portion of that funding to assist those 250 businesses with their compliance and quality management requirements, and I'm pleased to say we were successful with that. So that's one area in which funding is available, and that's for businesses to become registered. But also under the Green Homes Grant Skills Training Scheme, there were 18 successful participants in that tendering process, and many of those are colleges, training centres and so on, that have funding available for individuals to undertake NVQs. And if that individual is currently out of work, that NVQ, I believe, can be fully subsidised. And for everybody else, I believe it's 70% subsidised. So it could simply be, that a tradesperson has, an ongoing business, but they want to move more towards energy efficiency measures, and there's a whole range of support available for them to train up to do that. As I say, we have some of that funding available to assist the businesses of tradespeople to become certified to the standard, but there are also individual vocational training opportunities created there as well. So that's the Green Homes Grant Skills Training Scheme. You just need to Google that, and on the government website there is a list of the 18 organisations that are participating in upskilling people for that. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I hope so. Yep.
No,
Oh,
not really.
Yep.
Could I, so if you're at school having to stay on till 17, 18, whatever, and you want to go to college, are there going to be an increased number of places in building departments? Because hopefully there will be increased opportunities for young people.
I don't know a specific answer to that in terms of colleges creating more places. I suppose that's something that I'm a little bit outside. We deal with education, but more vocational sort of education in this case. The only way I think answer that is to say a lot more is being done to move towards vocational training and qualifications. So people are going to college to learn a specific trade that might, that will be backed up by a series of MVQs and so on. Just from my day-to-day work, I do a lot of driving in my job, and I hear a lot mainly listen to talk radio stations, and I hear a lot on the radio about, more places being created, more opportunities becoming available. I'm afraid I don't know.
Okay, just before we move on to the worked examples then, Jackie Lawrence has actually just sent in a bit of information that she thinks that apprenticeships, that the Institute of Apprenticeships are looking at creating a range of new green stroke eco apprenticeships. So I would imagine, Pippa, that this is something that is coming down the line. Maybe it's too slow, but the important thing about training is training existing installers to get them up to speed. But clearly, looking at students leaving school and looking for a green career, it's lots of opportunities now if they can find the appropriate training and then appropriate apprenticeship.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Can we move back just to the worked example, the worked examples that you've done, just to run through that?
Yes, of course. So just this was really just done to illustrate some. Excuse me. This was really just done to illustrate some of the ways in which the scheme can work. And I mentioned earlier on at the beginning of the presentation that there's £5,000 Green Homes grant contribution available for up to 2/3 of the cost of the work. So what I've done here is just a fictitious example. I put down 60 square metres of cavity wall insulation to be required. Now that's a primary measure, as well as 40 square metres of loft insulation, as again being a primary measure. I can only then, on a secondary measure, and the one that I've put down here is to install a smart thermostat and thermostatic radiator valves. I can only spend within the voucher up to the amount that I spent on primary measures. Still, that would give me, in that case, another potentially £1,800, because that's what's spent there on primary measures, to go towards secondary measures. But I've just put down the heating controls and just given some guide prices here. Prices will vary across the board, something I'll come on to in a moment. But these are a rough, accurate guesstimates, I suppose. So the total scope of works there would cost £2,400 to install. And so in that instance, the Green Homes grant covers 2/3 of that cost, so £1,600, and the customer contribution to have those 3 measures installed would be £800, which I think represents very good value, really, to have those 3 measures tackled for, you know, out my own pocket, £800. Worth pointing out that if the customer is eligible for the up to £10,000 voucher, that total amount of £2,400 would be fully funded. The second example I've focused on there in green is a quote for solid wall insulation. That's a much more expensive measure to deliver because you have to consider all of the building services that we were discussing, as well as scaffold. You know, it can become quite a large building project. But as a rough guide, and that price there of £125 per square metre might be a slight bit on the high side. We're generally quoting at about 120 at the moment, so it'd be slightly lower than that. But I did that to make the maths easy. You can see from that example that that's £7,500 quote to install solid wall insulation on a property. £5,000 of that would be covered by the Green Homes grant. £2,500 would be covered by the customer contribution. If that quote were to go above that £7,500, let's say it was a larger property, then any additional would be covered by the customer contribution, because we've reached the ceiling of what the Green Homes grant can contribute there. So many measures are priced based on how much, certainly in terms of insulation, needs to be installed, so per square metre. So it's a bit of a sliding scale. And I have had customers come to us, you know, with our coordinator hat on and say, you know, we've got a quote for external wall insulation, but it's £25,000, and you know, your guide price is said, you know, £7,000 to £15,000. Now that's largely because, well, the property just is much bigger than those kind of example guide prices were. You know, the more external wall you have, the more costly the work is going to be to do in that case. But what we would advise, coming on to this, is a few considerations along the lines of consumer protection and consumer confidence. We've already mentioned the role of the retrofit coordinator, and that's going to become a mandatory approach shortly. We'd look at the trading history of any installers that you choose to select to do the work, and Trustmarque themselves don't recommend instructing businesses that are less than 12 months old. and probably they wouldn't even be Trustmark registered or admitted onto the scheme. But it's well worth speaking to customers of previous customers of installers, looking at Google reviews and things like Checkatrade and so on. Don't be afraid to ask the installer to see previous examples of their work, certainly if it's something you would be able to see, and to speak to previous customers. And the reason I'm also mentioning this is it's important, very important with a scheme like this, to look out for what we've termed opportunistic pricing. We know that it happens. We think the scheme has a very good handle on it, and they're stopping it. But the temptation is, okay, the installer sees, okay, the customer is getting £5,000 or £10,000 contribution here, and therefore they inflate the price of the work that's actually to be undertaken. So I would, it's worth keeping an eye on that. We cannot the scheme will not work if that happens. And from a consumer protection point of view, at the end of the day, you still need to pay that customer contribution if there is one. And so any inflation of the price is going to inflate that contribution as well. If you're in doubt about anything like that, I'd contact Trustmark, speak to your retrofit coordinator if you've instructed one. They'll help you to navigate the pricing landscape. It's just something that is an unfortunate side effect of installer businesses seeing free money becoming available. Okay. Also worth pointing out, just on that, if you're seeking quotes, I always think it's important that the quote is as detailed as it possibly can be within reason. So if I'm seeking a quote for work on my property, I'd be looking to see certainly for something like this, and if it was a more complicated or a more expensive measure, I'd be wanting to see a proper 3 or 4 page breakdown of exactly what was going to happen, almost like a small method statement, along with all of the terms, the pricing, detailed in a transparent way, measurements, times, rate, etc., so that could all be verified. I think that's an important thing. Okay.
Thank you. Nobody's asked this question, but there has been a lot of negative press about the Green Homes Grant Scheme. Like everything else, I suppose, in our country, the press sort of land on negativity. There has been mis-selling in the early stages of the Green Homes Grant. But my personal view is that with the implementation of past 2035 and having retrofit assessors, coordinators and installers all assessed and qualified and registered with Trustmark, the scheme will only get better. Cold calling people is not something I would think that Trustmark accredited people will do, primarily because they should be too busy at the moment making use of this generous government offering. So it's like everything else. If somebody comes to you and says, this is just such a fantastic offer, you just need to take care. And as Andrew has said, get 2, 3 quotes, and then you can compare one with the other, and obviously meet people, being careful within how we're in with COVID. In fact, that's the point, Andrew, at the moment. We haven't had any COVID questions. So what's the situation in terms of your specific company? Clearly doing external work is sort of not a problem as far as COVID health and safety is concerned. But what about internal measures?
Right, so Trustmark released some guidance called Work Safe, Keep Safe. We receive regular communications from gov.uk, which indicate that we are allowed to continue working both in and outside dwellings at the moment. subject to precautionary measures being taken. So the way we do it as a business, and everyone's different, we have a COVID policy. All of our installation teams and assessors and surveyors and so on undertake regular toolbox talks and with them, and they sign to indicate that they've gone through that process. In teams of installers are bubbled effectively, so there's no crossover between teams of installers. They're also regularly tested for COVID, usually on a weekly basis. Can vary a little bit, but we think we've got a pretty good handle on it. In terms of working indoors versus outdoors, the risks are far lower. So for solid wall insulation, our biggest enemy at the moment seems to be the weather, but it is still possible, based on government and Trustmark guidance, to continue to do work in people's homes, but it requires a really kind of considered approach. I wouldn't just be looking at allowing anybody in, multiple trades all at one time, to do whatever needs doing. I think that's potentially a recipe for disaster, but rather the organisation should have a COVID policy which covers, asking residents to move into rooms away from the work area whilst the work is undertaken, ensuring that installers work in pairs if it's for more lightweight measures that don't require teams of installers, work in pairs so that one delivers to the property the materials as required whilst one is installing them, and so on. So again, keeping that kind of thing to a minimum and contact to a minimum. There's a bit of a rule of thumb and a bit of a situation where one has to just apply common sense, I suppose, but there should be some underlying policy. And while ever the government and Trustmark say that we're able to continue, we'll do so, but taking into account a whole range of considerations. Yeah.
Okay, this might be the last question, and then after you answer this, we'll hand back to John to close the proceedings. Our plan was to run this for an hour and a half, so we're doing well. 5 minutes to go. So the question is, to replace an old gas boiler, is there a viable, simple and economical heating option that uses standard electricity supply, perhaps from a green energy supplier, for example, an electric boiler, electric immersion, or is it too inefficient and costly to run?
I would say so. Inefficient, no. Electricity is the most efficient fuel, in that you use 100% of what you put in, you get back out. There's no loss in that process. But unfortunately, the price of electricity, however it's generated in this country, is very high. And so having your space heating covered by electricity only, as we currently stand, is always going to be a far more cost ineffective option than using mains gas or equivalent. That really, that's a kind of a broader discussion that needs to happen around that point. That really needs to shift. The more power that we generate ourselves, the more that utilities can generate through renewables, that should eventually drive down the cost of consuming electricity, at which point it may well, in the future, hopefully, in the next 15 years or so, be viable to take that approach. But I'd be wary of doing so now, because I think doing that to a property, any occupant, whatever their profile of occupancy, would see their bills shoot up, and we wouldn't want that to happen. So it's a shame. It would be nice, but yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. John.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much. Well, thanks to you, George, for chairing today, and thanks to everybody who tuned in and offered questions to our speaker. I'd also just like to thank Neil Eaton, the Deputy Town Clerk, who's helped us set up the Cisco system that we're using. And of course, finally to Andrew Brown. Thanks very much, Andrew, for giving us a great talk. I think we've all learned a great deal. Thanks for taking the time out for us. I just would like to remind local residents that they can keep up to date with news and activities around everything to do with climate change by signing up to the Climate Roadmap newsletter, and that's available on the Town Council website. And you can sign up for future copies if you want. So we're able to get together and discuss energy matters again in the future. But for now, thanks very much for attending, and goodbye to you all. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
I'm just trying to close this. It's not working.
I learned a great deal there.
Find how you stop sharing. Right. Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much for your time.